what he's going to talk about today is a public-private partnership that was put together within the city of Boston to look at how consumers are perceiving and are willing to adopt autonomous transportation within the city of Boston. And so I think it's going to be really exciting as we all try to capitalize on autonomy, to look at that perception and the lessons learned that they had in Boston on how the consumers are willing to accept it or not. So it gives you insight to introducing the technology. So without any more, John?
Great. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Just to get a little bit of a lay of the land here, how many of you are engineers or software people or have a technical background? Okay, great. So that's great for me because it's a little bit of a different audience, I guess, than I'm used to speaking. I was trained as an engineer. I started my career as a design engineer at Ford many years ago, and there you go, all right. And my whole career has really been built around mobility, the movement of people and goods. And for the past 11 and a half years, up until 6 weeks ago, I was the head of mobility at the World Economic Forum, which, as Bill mentioned, is an international organization based in Geneva. I helped to open up the office in New York, which is now grown. We've opened an office here in San Francisco in the Presidio, focused specifically on the policy frameworks around technology, and that's been really, really an exciting venture. So that's just a little bit about me. Now, let me tell you a bit about sort of why I'm here and what we've done at the forum. So we, as Bill mentioned, we entered into essentially a 3-year collaboration among the World Economic Forum, among a group of executives from car companies, from insurance companies, from energy companies that we had worked with to understand the implications of autonomous vehicles. And then into that collaboration, we welcomed the Boston Consulting Group and the City of Boston. So what happened was we started about 3.5 years ago looking at sort of the consumer implications of autonomous vehicles, adoption rates, a lot of work that probably you've seen in the past. And it became immediately evident to us that to have a greater impact, it would be great to actually work with a city. So we invited cities to collaborate with our working group. We've got 10 amazing applications, each one signed by the mayor, Amsterdam, Fukuoka, Japan, all over the map, Mexico City. And we ended up selecting the city of Boston to work with. And so what we did with the city really boils down to kind of these 3 items in red that I'd like to talk about today. So the first was looking actually at adoption rates of autonomous vehicles. So basically that consumer-oriented element of actually sitting down with people from the city of Boston and asking them about their viewpoints and the likelihood of how they would use autonomous vehicles. The second thing we did was then to understand, well, if people adopt autonomous vehicles around the city of Boston the way that we would expect, what would actually be the impact on traffic, on CO2 emissions, on safety, and a number of other parameters. And then the third thing that we did was we tried to actually catalyze the testing of autonomous vehicles in the city. Now, here we are in probably the world's epicenter of AV testing. Just passing a Waymo just on my way here tonight. But it's not like that in other parts of the world. Now, of course, now we have over 100 cities around the world that are actually engaged in some form of testing of autonomous vehicles. But I can tell you when we started this work with Boston 2 years ago, there were 0 companies testing AVs in the city. And today, there is actual AV testing that has happened. So Maybe just to start out with the first chunk, which is the consumer part. So we didn't just look at Boston, we also looked at Berlin and Shanghai to sort of understand what are the geographic implications. But it was a survey of around 7,000 consumers. And when we looked at these cities, we conducted what was called a conjoint analysis, which is basically to say, to sit people down and say, it's Tuesday morning, it's raining outside, you need to get to work, and you need to choose between two of these transportation options. So what you see up here is 8 different options, and we would always present a sort of discrete choice between option A and option B, and then move on to the next discrete choice. So if you look at the options that were presented, obviously some are very, very familiar to all of us.
You were actually interviewing citizens of Boston?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So Boston and the Berlin as well. So when we went through this kind of analysis, something like, all right, well, obviously, public transportation, very obvious, everyone sort of has used it in the past, they knew what it was all about. But even when this work was done, which was now about a year and a half ago, some of this stuff was really quite sort of new conceptually, and certainly the concept of a kind of autonomous minibus for many people, it's not something that they had ever used or envisioned or thought about before. So do you have a sort of inherent bias in this type of research? Of course you do, right? You're asking people to judge, would you likely use something that they've never used? I mean, imagine if we had done that with keyless entry or something like that for vehicles, 2 decades ago. The results may not have been entirely accurate. So we recognize that there's a certain inherent selection bias in this type of research, in this conjoint analysis. But nonetheless, and some interesting findings did emerge from this work, and I'll go through this in a little bit more detail, but the big finding was a major shift toward mobility on demand. Now again, just going back, mobility on demand is, the Ubers and the Lyfts and the Didis that are currently existing and everyone is using on a very regular basis, but it also includes, 3 autonomous modes that currently are, for the most part, not an option. So we see a pretty massive shift toward mobility on demand, and at the expense of mass transportation in the urban core. And that was sort of like I'll give you one of the kind of punchlines up front of what came out of this work, because that has a lot of implications. We definitely saw that adoption rates vary by income level, they vary by age, they vary by trip length, and so forth. So just to sort of dig into some of the results. Now looking at 3 cities, Boston, Berlin, Shanghai, I think the most important observation here, so what are we looking at? We're looking at the dark blue at the bottom, mobility on demand, the medium blue is personal car usage, and then the top light blue is mass transit. And so what we can see, I think, first of all, is that the pattern is the same in all 3 cities, and of course very different locations with very different mobility cultures. But the pattern is the same, and that is, and by the way, future you can sort of think of as a kind of 2030 time frame. What we see is that we gain in mobility on demand, but more or less at the expense of the personal car and to some degree mass transportation as well. And of course, the reason that the shift toward mobility on demand is important, because at least in the way that we had constructed this analysis, a good chunk of that was autonomous vehicles. But looking at this, even based on our, again, consumer research, we didn't see this sort of future where 10 years from now, the majority of people are going to be getting around in the city of Boston or Berlin or Shanghai using autonomous vehicles. It would be a very significant increase, but it certainly wouldn't be the kind of the majority of trips. So if we dig in a little bit and look specifically, it's tough to see this, but this is sort of the actual map of the city of Boston proper. So for those of you who are familiar, the Charles River is running here, Cambridge is up here, and then you have Brookline and surrounding towns as well. So it's a very irregularly shaped geography. And when we looked at the city proper versus the surrounding area of Cambridge and Newton and so forth, we saw some differences as well. So certainly you see that the public transport share for the urban core really suffers from 47% of trips made today to 33% based on this future model. Whereas on the suburban side, we didn't see as dramatic effect. In fact, even a slight increase in public transport percent of trips.
We talked about the percent autonomous vehicle that's within the mobility and the on-demand.
Right.
You have many different technologies here, many different implementations. It's a very broad category. You have 88% of that 41%.
Correct.
Is
autonomous.
Is the autonomous side of those technologies.
Yep.
Do you have any further breakout of, is that autonomous minibus or is it autonomous car? I guess it's not autonomous personal car.
It is. Yeah,
Well,
no, it's not. No, it's not. It's not autonomous personal car. No. Let me go back to the categories. So this autonomous personal car was not included in the mobility on demand. But you would see some autonomous vehicles in the personal car usage because there will be some uptake of this type of vehicle based on our analysis. But your question is, look, can you break it down to these 8 specific categories? We have that data. I don't have it handy on me.
Is there because you can think about autonomous minibus as the same bus routes as the driverless bus. So those two things are they equivalent, or is there a different model to public transportation?
I don't think of those two things as equivalent. I think of the way that we think of a bus right now is there's a bus stop and the bus has presumably some sort of schedule. So it's like it's a fixed route with some sort of timetable.
And in Boston, the arrivals have to be pre-branded.
That's true. That is absolutely true. Whereas this vehicle is really envisioned as something that is it's a dynamic function of supply and demand.
On that next slide, it shows the percentage of riders in the different categories.
Yeah.
Can you go to that?
Sure.
What's the difference between autonomous taxi and minibus on this slide?
So autonomous taxi is a typical 2 to 5 person vehicle, whereas the minibus is more of a 12 passenger vehicle.
So that's driverless Uber X and driverless Uber Pool, effectively, right? Kind of,
Well, no, Uber Pool is autonomous shared taxi.
Yeah, I mean, pool is, but it's mostly like, a Toyota Corolla coming to pick you up, right? That's not
It's multiple people getting in and out, I guess, at different stops. And it's
Anyway, the point is Uber Pool is
Right.
that category called autonomous shared taxi.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. What we think of right now as, Uber Pool is much more this category here. This is a larger vehicle. So, I mean, you guys have seen the Navia vehicles, for example, or Easy Mile, those types of vehicles where they're putting together basically an autonomous shuttle to move people around. This holds, a good 12 passengers. Yeah, please.
Is all of the data kind of based on this surveying of individuals and the projection of their kind of what they think they will be
Right.
doing in the future.
Yes.
And I understand that you're, for the sake of maybe the presentation, not going into that, but sort of maybe you can give us a flavor of how well the picture kind of was painted for them, right? There's cost implications and things that, like you said, that people don't really grasp the future reality. So, can you talk a little bit about how, in terms of the creation of this, that picture was painted so that, because everything is kind of incumbent upon them making informed choices about a future reality that they don't really know yet, right?
Absolutely. I mean, so it was a use case type of situation. Right. So they were given, they would have a very different response if it's Friday night and I'm going out with friends versus it's Tuesday morning and it's raining and I'm late for work. So it was a situational thing based on these 4 factors. And then there were some costs that were factored in for the use of the various types of the 8 modes. And those costs were, per mile costs that were very kind of back of envelope. But it gave the respondent an idea. I mean, clearly, if you're late for work, you're more likely to pay a lot more to get to work in the morning than in other situations.
I was thinking that the percentage of people who use the various modes of transportation, that could be skewed a lot by people who haven't yet reached the age of working adulthood, who are used to taking Ubers and Lyfts. And I could see them much more rapidly changing those percentages than working adults would now.
Well, you're absolutely correct, because when we sliced it by age, we saw much higher adoption rates for younger people than for older people. We've seen that. I mean, I think AARP has done some studies as well that have sort of similar results. And there's 2 factors there. I would say one is that older people are, sometimes more resistant, shall we say, to new technologies, might be one factor. But another is also just the culture of driving is changing, right? I mean, we all know that younger people are less enthusiastic about running out and getting their driver's license when they turn 16 or 17 now than they were 20 years ago.
So I have the feeling we're in for a surprise in the percentage of people that don't use the on-demand trips. And I expect it to be even higher than we even think right now.
Yep.
On the next slide or 2, I'm curious, how did the cities feel about going? And the next one. So Boston specifically, I'm guessing you interacted more with the city of Boston.
Yes.
And I'm curious which department in the city, and how did they feel about this possible decrease of mass transit ridership?
Highly concerned.
They freaked, as you would expect.
Yeah.
What's that?
I said, as you expect, they freaked.
Yeah.
So do they make or lose? Is it a money thing or is it a traffic thing?
You mean why were they concerned about?
I thought that they lost money on mass transit on the balance in most cities.
Every city in the world loses money on mass
But that's
transit.
not what they're worried about apparently. If they're freaking out, they don't like
No,
that. They're
it's
not
not-
worried about the budget.
I'll give you the cynical answer.
All right.
Transit is a pure good in and of itself for these people. Whether it's not the result, it's not how much energy is used, it's not how much congestion is caused. It's a transit is good.
So
It's what they do.
I mean, there's some truth to that. I mean, so what Boston did was they at least took the time, to their credit, to ask themselves, what do we want? And they got a grant from the Bar Foundation, which is a local foundation, for the city to go out and, similar to what we did, sit down with people and say, what do you want out of transportation for your city? And they went through this whole process of interviewing Bostonians, and they boiled it down to 3 things: safety, reliability, and access. So safety, reliability, that makes sense. Access is really about, how the single mom that lives in Dorchester, how can we ensure that she can get to work downtown without taking, 2 transfers to do that.
and the reason, I guess I'm not surprised that they're concerned, but in manufacturing, batch processing is bad because there's a lot of waste, right? And it's the same thing in transit. And Brad,
I mean, like an empty city bus.
yeah, and I think Brad, I remember, I think you had on your blog, but it was a infographic that showed the least efficient way to transport people is 2 people in a bus or 2 people on light rail, which is 80% of the day.
Not 9 people. The average American bus holds 9 people.
Yeah, which is
It does not
just
include rush hour.
outrageous.
Yeah,
Well,
because
it's average.
yeah, it's average. So it's very efficient at rush hour.
Yes.
But the other 80% of the day, they're just they're wasting energy and time.
The thing I'm writing now that's freaking them out is I'm doing the math that says that the optimum vehicle size is that minibus for energy efficiency. And so because they have this strong ingrained thing that bigger is better for energy efficiency. But bigger means more people on it, more inconvenience for those people, therefore lower load factor, therefore lower efficiency.
Bigger is better if it's fully utilized, but if it's not,
For cities.
Right. Sorry.
let's do 1, 2, 3. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, also, I mean, back to his point, there are so many ways this can be presented. I mean, route-based systems versus on-demand systems are completely different.
Yeah.
Was that, I mean, I suppose that's dispensing with conventional mass transit and going with this. And I hope that Boston, that's a horrible subject.
Well,
It should be a great thing.
Yeah.
No, should be embracing
And
this.
there's 2 sides to your question. One is how well do consumers understand a concept that doesn't yet fully exist? We start to get it because we've now been using Lyft and Uber for many years, so we start to get that concept of flexibility of routing. But how well does the city get that you don't need fixed bus lines anymore? I think in the case of the city of Boston, they're quite shrewd about it, and they're on top of those types of issues. Yes.
I guess one question that the cities will have to ask themselves: do we tear up the railroad tracks and pave those valuable rights of way and dedicate them to autonomous minivans?
Yeah.
There was an interview with me on the New York Times where I said that, and yet I got me a lot of flack.
I got upset.
Yeah, people do not like that idea.
Yeah.
Not yet.
Yeah. No, it's been proposed in Boston as well, where they have a commuter rail network. I don't know if it's come up here on like the Caltrain that I took to get here, but
Well, I proposed it for Caltrain and for the central subway that they're building in San Francisco. It cost $2 billion.
yeah. Please.
This group, which is called Suburban,
Yeah.
are those people who work in Boston and live in the suburbs?
It's all of the above. So it's people that may live in
So
Cambridge and work in Boston, and Cambridge itself, I mean, is not most people's notion of suburban.
But it was a mixture of all people with
Yeah.
no effort to specify it to work in.
Yes. Yep. Yep. So it's people that both live in the suburbs and work in the city, and probably a few that have just the opposite situation.
Because I think that people who live around here and work in Palo Alto might have quite a different response than people who live here and work in San Francisco.
Yeah.
Because San Francisco is horrible to go to.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, every geography has its own unique dynamics, right? I mean, the Bay Area is, it's special, right? I mean, the San Jose is a bigger city, I guess, than San Francisco. And so you have a different flow structure. I think Boston is a little bit more of the classical, still centralized structure, rather than having these kind of two poles with a bunch of other smaller towns in between. Please.
So I moved here from Nashville, and one thing I learned from the city management of Nashville, and talked to people in other cities as well, is I think these cities see an opportunity in these changes in transit to kind of move themselves up on the scale of city coolness, right? Because you've got Boston, New York City, LA, San Francisco, Chicago, cities that kind of monopolize the urban life. But cities like Nashville and Salt Lake and Boise and others want to become cool too. And I wonder if they'll be more willing to do the kind of thing that you guys say about paving over rail and being the first to do mobility.
Yeah.
It sounds right.
Yeah.
Columbus, Ohio. Exactly.
Columbus, Ohio.
Yeah.
Did the cities, and I wonder, did you notice the cities, do they feel, what's driving them the most? I think you said there were 3 things. It's mostly giving people access in their city. Is there any
So for
spirit
the
of
city-
competition there? Or?
Safety, reliability, and access.
Yeah, for the city of Boston, it emerged as safety, reliability, and access.
Access,
But what has struck me, I will say this, we've done a lot of work with city mayors around the world. I've been quite impressed with that access formula, how now mayors really understand a bit more, I think, why transport matters than in the past.
Where was rider satisfaction on all this?
Well, reliability is kind of a,
No, reliability was one tiny part of rider satisfaction.
yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, if the trains are,
Right, but I mean, if you ask riders what they want from their transportation system, rider satisfaction is number one.
Yeah.
I'm surprised the cities, and cost, rider satisfaction, those would be the.
yeah. Okay, let me circle back so I can get through this. So let's see. So this is a chart looking at income levels, neighborhoods, two neighborhoods, a relatively high income neighborhood and a relatively low income neighborhood in each of the three cities. And of course, the result is quite consistent that the AV adoption rate is higher in the relatively higher income neighborhoods. So no big surprise there. This is looking at trip length. There was this kind of anomaly in Shanghai, and to make a long story short, I think the answer is we don't know why that came up. There's a whole bunch of theories, but generally, certainly in Boston and Berlin, it was clear that, as the trip got shorter, the adoption rates increased for autonomous vehicles.
When you saw this income-based difference, what did you tell them it would cost?
Well, there were, I don't remember the precise numbers, for each of those 8 different modes, but there were per mile costs, dollar per mile costs inserted. So they were given this kind of hypothetical, sort of roundabout estimate of the cost level.
Because this is actually, I mean, there's already in New York, certainly in some other places, people who are moving to Uber from car ownership because the cost of parking and a variety of other factors actually make it a cheaper alternative. And so your income doesn't matter, it's you go for the cheaper one.
Yeah.
The poor people go for the cheaper one even more.
Yeah.
And you'd have the reverse, so that's why I'm wondering what cost you told them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Could you break this down anywhere along the lines of comparing rates of car ownership in each city versus these results? If I had to guess, I'd say the rates of car ownership in Shanghai is a lot lower. That might be driving the used to be.
Yeah, that's right. It used to be. No, we don't have that figure to look across the cities. We're really just looking to see if the patterns were more or less the same. But I mean, Shanghai is a highly motorized city now. Okay, so let me just shift gears a little bit. That was all this kind of consumer research that we did, sitting down with people from those 3 cities, and in particular with the city of Boston. So then the other thing that I mentioned that we really wanted to do was to help kind of catalyze testing of autonomous vehicles in the city of Boston. And then this is just kind of a chart of how it laid out. When we actually, when the forum announced our collaboration with the city, that was here in September 2016, and by January 2017, the first vehicle was out on the streets of the city. Was that because of the World Economic Forum? No. Did we play a big part of that? Yes, absolutely. And so it was interesting to see sort of the city and the state collaborate quickly to put together the MOU with the enabling structure to have AVs on the streets and to get these companies actually testing. And the way that it works in the city of Boston, so again, all the colored parts here are this kind of really wacky geography of the city of Boston. These are the different neighborhoods. And there's this district here that's called the Seaport that is sort of a rapidly modernizing, lots of building going on there. That was where the city started. And even within the Seaport, they started in a sort of remote industrial park of the Seaport, and then sort of through this staged process expanded the testing to other parts of the city, and then actually just in June, AV's now expanded to the entire city. AV testing expanded to the entire city of Boston. So again, compared to here, where you guys see these vehicles cruising around all the time, it might seem quite mundane. But for Boston to move so quickly, it was a pretty I'd say substantial accomplishment. And then sort of like, well, what was learned through all of that process? The clear mobility vision, that was what I was telling you about with the grant from the Barr Foundation to do what was called Boston 2030, the study of what do people actually want out of their transportation system. I think that was a really great thing that the city had invested in before we arrived on the scene. This robot block party that took place just about a year ago was also, I think, a really kind of cool practice where, there's a lot of robotics activity going on in the city of Boston. It's not just around autonomous vehicles, but sort of this notion of getting people more familiar with the vehicles, I think was actually a really great practice that the city implemented. And I think there's stuff like that happens as well here in the Bay Area.
And is the fittings in, you could go on and look at them and close up?
Yeah, exactly. And it's not like you could drive around in the AVs, but you could sort of look at them, and then they had people from Autonomy there explaining sort of how it works, how the vehicle functions. So just kind of getting it out there that this is happening, and getting feedback from people. Okay, let me now shift gears again to the third part of the talk, which is about the impact study. So, we asked consumers, would you be likely to use autonomous vehicles? We got these results. And then we took those results and we built a model. This is with the BCG Gamma team, their data analytics team. They basically built a model saying, well, what would be the impact? And we started small with 1 square kilometer around City Hall, and sort of, an agent-based model that, looked at these factors of, what typical following distance is, and what the infrastructure is, and the different types of usage, from pedestrians to taxis, the usage of the streets, and then expanded that last year, into a much more comprehensive model of the entire city of Boston. And we took some data sets from, not just from the city, but also from UPS on deliveries and from INRIX, and basically also modeled in, this to me was quite interesting, the impact of the greater efficiency that you would have if you had a substantial share of autonomous vehicles as part of your fleet. So what I mean by that is if you only add 1 autonomous vehicle to the streets, it doesn't make the streets more efficient. But if half of the cars are autonomous vehicles on the streets, and presumably they have a way of interacting with each other that makes more sense than the way that some of us humans drive, there's going to be some efficiency gain. And the chart, actually, it's an interesting chart because when you go up to 100% autonomous vehicles as percent of the fleet, you get a 25% overall efficiency gain, according to the model that these guys put together. So, it's not sort of life-changing, but it is a significant impact. And so we factored that into the model as well. And very importantly, we used the results of that conjoint analysis as the input to the model. So we asked people, how likely would you be to use these vehicles in these situations? We got the data, and then we inputted that into this model. And so here are the results. So 15% less cars on the streets of the city of Boston, 16% increase in vehicle kilometers traveled, almost a 50% reduction in the number of parking places needed in the city, and a 4% reduction in travel time. So, what's really significant here, to me, it's these bottom two. So this is from the perspective of the city, and just by the way, about half of the parking places in the city of Boston are on-street parking, and the other half are parking structures, okay? So imagine you had 50% less on-street parking in Boston or London or New York or wherever. Obviously, it's there's some really interesting opportunities for how you could repurpose that street space. And then the 4% reduction in travel time, it's like, okay, well, that's significant, but it's certainly not transformational. And it's certainly quite a bit less than some of our initial analysis and some other work that's been done by the International Transport Forum on their Lisbon study and so forth. They've come up with these higher numbers. So when you dig into that 4% reduction in average travel time.
Before you go there, though,
Yep.
so you've got VMT going up and road usage going down. Is that because you're presuming tighter spacing between vehicles? Is it because you're assuming something distributing the vehicles across more widely across the road system happening? How are you getting that?
So the VMT goes up because you have some empty miles, right? I mean, to reposition the vehicles to where they need to be to move
But it
people
also goes up
around.
because a better form of transportation and it's naturally more attractive to people, so they use it more.
Possibly because it's shared.
But anyway, I agree VMT goes up. How does volume traffic volume go down while VMT goes up?
No, I'm just parsing what you said before. So because we didn't get into the whole sort of like induced demand. This is basically assuming that the overall level of mobility stays constant, so that people move around the city at the same amount, that we're not actually consuming more.
Well, your chart showed
mobility.
that they would move out of transit, for example, and into these road vehicles.
Correct.
So that would increase VMT.
Yeah, yes, the shift from transit to road vehicles could actually.
Anyway, so VMT definitely goes up for all those reasons.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, how are you getting traffic volume going down? Is it just from shorter headways?
How are you getting the number of vehicles on the road going down?
Yeah.
Because we're using quite a bit of shared vehicles now.
But VMT is going up, so it doesn't matter how many people are in there.
So we're packing more people, right, into these shared vehicles.
That doesn't affect this.
But the vehicles are there, and 16% more.
Normally, more vehicles on the road means more traffic volume on the road. More miles traveled means more traffic volume, unless the miles are all in the suburbs.
Okay, traffic volume on the road is number of vehicles, right? Those are the same thing. So we're saying with this model, you have fewer vehicles because you're using a lot more shared, whether it's a shared minibus or a shared lift, you have these shared, so you have fewer vehicles.
I'm not getting that.
Vehicle distance.
Not getting-
Well, I mean, if you share a vehicle and it carries 4 people and drives 4 times as much, the traffic volume on the road is the same.
That's not people distance travel, that's vehicle distance.
That's right. This is
So you
vehicle
can't-
miles traveled. It's not.
So vehicle distance vehicle miles traveled can't go up with traffic volume going down,
Right.
unless you're accounting for something like shorter headways or better distribution to other roads, using roads that weren't used before, those kind of things. That's I'm just asking which of those
Or
things.
the efficiencies you get from autonomous cars being able to get in less fewer traffic.
So less congestion could help.
Yeah, that's a factor. But as I said, that only impacts up to like 25%.
But no, that still doesn't even help
enough
enough
to cover.
Yeah,
So when you say traffic volume on the road, is that actual vehicles?
it's number of vehicles.
So the number of vehicles times the distance traveled is going to be the same, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm saying those two numbers shouldn't be opposite without another factor.
Right. Yeah.
They should be the same.
But let's just be careful about the distinction between vehicle miles traveled and passenger miles traveled, right? Because when you're packing more
Neither of those
people
is,
into-
passenger isn't in here. It's traffic volume, number of vehicles on the road, and distance the vehicles go.
That's the
This is
vehicle.
vehicle miles traveled, not passenger.
That's exactly right.
But
If
it's
it were
also-
passengers, I would certainly would make perfect sense, but it's not passengers.
Right.
It's also vehicle traffic volume, vehicles.
Occupancy isn't a coefficient in either of these equations.
Yeah. See, I don't get these questions when I talk to the policy crowd. So the engineers and software guys.
We're all about
Another question.
Okay, well, we can look it up later then.
Yeah,
I don't know right now.
it's a good point. Okay, other
I have a
questions?
question about the last one.
Yeah, that's what I was
I mean, one of the great benefits of ride-hailing today, with a driver, and certainly, autonomous taxi, which is 3 of those options now, is that it takes you from point A to point B, you don't have to park. So
Yeah.
I'm surprised that the average travel time is that including, I think that's not including the time that it would
Parking.
have taken
It's
to
not.
walk through your parking garage. So that's
Yeah.
a pretty significant part of the time.
Yeah.
That I would have factored in.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's
So
awesome.
it's not looking at, I mean, my trip from where my hotel to here
Yeah.
was obviously a multi-chain trip, and no, it doesn't account for
Just
that.
explain how it takes 52 minutes to fly to Los Angeles from San Jose, but it takes 3 hours.
Yeah,
for you to do it.
yeah. Please.
You already talked about the parking space and 48% reduction, maybe a little bit of a policy question. When I see that, I wonder if that's going to make cities less inclined to want to adopt or support autonomous just from a revenue standpoint. So, for instance, a friend of mine is a CISO for the city of San Francisco. One of his chief objectives is protecting the parking meters because it's such a huge source of revenue. It's not the PII, it's the parking meters.
Yeah.
And so this is a huge driver for municipalities. So it seems like they would be pretty resistant to it if they believe that protection
I
factor.
won't tell them this.
Yeah.
Seriously, one of my favorite ironic questions I'll get is that, oh, if these cars don't speed and you don't give them tickets anymore, what's going to happen to all those towns that live off where the police department is only paid for by tickets?
Yeah.
And I say, this is a problem?
So many skyscrapers.
Find something else.
It is for the people who
That
need
pays
it.
for the whole thing.
Yeah.
I have a thought about the roadside parking that's freed up. That's very valuable for pickup and drop off for autonomous Lyfts and Ubers. And it could be, you could pay a fee to pick up and drop off on that curb space.
Like Apple and Google pay for their buses up in San Francisco.
No, their parking revenue is going to go to Shem, they're going to use it. Don't tell them.
But they charge for pickup and drop off curb spaces.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of where you'll see where this goes. So this, yeah, please.
How much was ride sharing, how much was AVs, and how much was the rest?
So it was the output from that first chunk of research that I showed you that we used as the input to this impact model. So, specifically, if we just go back. Oops. It was this, right, that was inputted into the model. So if you ask what percent, you got to take this 87% in the suburbs, up to 26% and so forth. And there was a percent of AVs in here in personal car as well. Okay, so we're at this 4% figure, which is not exactly like earth-shattering. And so when you drill down into it, what you see is if you look at different neighborhoods within the city, the impact is quite different. So specifically in the downtown core, traffic actually gets worse in this situation. That's what the model demonstrated. But in a neighborhood like Alston, which is in the city of Boston proper, but not close to the downtown, you actually get quite a significant improvement, more than 4.3%, 12% improvement in travel time. So this is really, as a consumer, what you want. You want to get from point A to point B, faster, provided that it's still safe and comfortable and all the other typical parameters of mobility. So this was, a really sort of concerning outcome from the study, certainly for the city, to say that, wow, we could actually have, because of substitution from public transport in the downtown core to these types of surface vehicles, we could actually have traffic get worse. That's not a situation that we want to be in. So we looked at some of the different levers that could be pulled to have a more positive outcome. And specifically, occupancy-based pricing is essentially charging for vehicles that only have one person using them. I guess with autonomous vehicles, you could also charge for vehicles that have 0 people in them. Converting street parking is about repurposing all of that freed up parking space on the street. And there's different ideas for how to do that, with sort of creating these pickup drop-off spots for, for shared vehicles, or simply just adding a lane, and different concepts that we looked at. But also you gain quite a bit of improvement. So this is all saying, instead of a 4% improvement in travel time, we could actually gain a 15% or 15.5% or 10% or 8% if these other policy levers are pulled, dedicated AV lanes being the third one. So now all of a sudden you start saying, well, that starts to get significant. And I think this is, the conversation that cities are having around the world about, what are those different levers that we can pull with autonomous vehicles so that we get positive outcomes. They kind of recognize the, sort of the Robin Chase model of autonomous vehicle heaven, autonomous vehicle hell, and what are the various policies that can be used to nudge us toward autonomous vehicle heaven. So
congestion charging and metering not get on their radar?
Well, this essentially is a sort of crude form of congestion charging.
Is the city of Boston willing to experiment with these different levers in the future?
Yeah. I mean, they're very interested, but of course, with an eye on the political pulse as well, right? So, congestion charging, which is really
politically been a no-go in the United States, but it's happening in more cities outside.
Right. And it will be interesting to see if we see a shift in that in the U.S. as well with time. As autonomous fleets start picking up and the technology advances. Please.
I don't know how you would measure this, but there should be a metric for satisfaction for transportation. So I ride a bus almost every day to work that my employer provides, and I'm sitting there doing things I want to do. And that's not really accounted for in the drive time or whatever. It's just maybe satisfaction for getting from point A to change.
Comfort levels and so forth. Absolutely.
Well, and maybe utility as well. I can be productive rather than having driven in Boston. It was generally not a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, it's not. Absolutely.
It's a blood sport.
It's a what?
Blood sport.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, competitive sport. Yes, please.
There's so much real estate dedicated to personal cars. In my autonomous company, I've always wanted the garages to be turned into mini spaces for homeless and other people. Does that ever come up?
Well, the notion of how land use and transportation are so intensely linked, and in particular parking now, I think it's becoming a bit of a hot
you
topic.
mentioned street parking.
Yes.
And then there's the structures.
And then there's the structures as well. Sure. I mean, there's certainly, we've heard from executives at the big engineering and construction companies who have talked about, now we try to sort of if we build a parking garage, for example, we plan that building could be repurposed for something different, 10, 15, 20 years into its life. Whereas, before they were just building a parking garage.
Do you suspect that some of that existing garage space will be repurposed to serve autonomous vehicles, recharging, maintenance, and things like that?
Yeah.
Keep them close to the customer.
Yeah.
Some of it.
Yeah, the kind of notion of AV depots, scattered at central locations throughout the city.
Yeah, my real estate developer clients say that their biggest problem now is the cities keep insisting they must build a lot of parking with every real estate developer.
Yeah.
San Francisco's the reverse. It's actually limiting. Toronto's doing the reverse and limiting it. But most cities say you want to build a condo tower, you got to have this much parking in it.
And it's kind of nutty, if you really think about those regulations.
I just like to think of real estate as going for people instead of cars.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now that concept that, who are we building for, right? Is it, are we designing cities for cars, or are we designing cities for people? I think is, people are now sort of starting to recognize that, and it's become, in my view, more part of the public consciousness than it was, 20 years ago.
Cars are not yet autonomous enough that they exist for themselves. Cars are only there for people. So everything done for cars is done for people, but just not that directly.
Yeah.
Or transportation of parcels.
But that's for people.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you. I was telling Bill that I got up today to catch a 6:50 flight from Boston this morning, so I'm up for a little while. I hope I haven't had too much of a low energy level, but I appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk to all of you.
Thank you, John. Great delivery, great information, and yeah, you were talking to a group of engineers, I can tell it right away.